So let's get started talking about the lesson eight, rhetorical listening, second round rough draft. So for this lesson, we are going to continue to write our rough draft, and you should have by the end of this week an introduction, a discussion one, and a discussion two. You'll probably want to write your conclusion next week. If you're feeling motivated, you're welcome to go ahead and write it. But I don't really consider when I'm writing a complete rough draft, I don't really consider that my conclusion, just because sometimes it's hard enough to write a paper. But you want me to add a conclusion to it, and that's not much fun. And so I tend to only count a complete rough draft as introduction, discussion one, and discussion two, and I'll kind of put together a conclusion when I'm feeling less mentally fatigued, so to speak. So remember, for this assignment, you need to have an introduction that opens up the paper. Now remember, you need to assume an unfamiliar reader. And because you need to assume an unfamiliar reader, you will need to summarize the This I Believe essay that you're focusing on. So probably your first paragraph is going to summarize that essay. Your second paragraph in your introduction will need to include your thesis statement. And your thesis statement in this paper are the two points that you're making, either the two themes that we see illustrated in the two cultural logics that we see illustrated in the This I Believe essay, or the two significant events in the author's life that influenced his or her rhetorical or This I Believe essay. And then you'll want to include in your paper two discussion sections. So the first discussion section would be the first moment or event or cultural logic. And then the second discussion would be the second moment, the second event, or the second cultural logic. So I've also included for you here just kind of a kind of reiterating larger organization that you see within these discussion sections. And I linked here to those content pages in Canvas on kind of how to organize your discussion sections, moving from general to specific, incorporating research, the models that you can look at. But I want to take a moment to look at my example that I wrote about Temple Grandin. And so the paper that you're going to be turning in this week, you want it to look a bit more like this, right? So if you'll notice here, it's in Word now. So I've moved it out of Canvas and it's in Word. I have the MLA heading at the top. I have a title. It's Times New Roman, 12-point font, double spaced. So you want to start making your paper look a bit more like this. I also went through here and added comments that you can illustrate the rhetorical moves that I'm doing in that section. So I put Jane Smith here. It was me. I wrote this paper. So here's the title for my paper: Listening Rhetorically, Understanding Temple Grandin's Life Through the Lens of Autism. So here's my model. So now, if you recall from last week, the model that I shared with you, I pretty much wrote introduction, write this, because I was kind of struggling at that point. So I've actually gone back and written my introduction. So in 2020, 1 in 54 Americans are diagnosed with autism, and they have more resources and services available than ever before. So I used a statistic, remember from that content page on lesson 8, I talked about how you can use a statistic or sources to start a point, right, to open up a paper. So that's what I did here. I used this statistic from Data and Statistics on Autism Spectrum Disorders to open up the conversation. All right, so in 2020, 1 in 54 Americans are diagnosed with autism, and they have more resources and services than ever before. However, this was not always the case. So I've let in, now I'm moving into Temple Grandin's essay. Autism was stigmatizing, and many people with autism were misunderstood. Temple Grandin has worked to promote more understanding about autism, and in her essay, Seeing in Beautiful, Precise Pictures, from the This I Believe collection, she describes for readers how she thinks in pictures and sounds, rather than in abstraction. For Grandin, this means that when someone says the word love, she sees a catalog of images, mother and child, images from films, lyrics from popular songs that represent the idea. This concrete way of seeing the world made it difficult for Grandin growing up because she did not understand abstract concepts like be nice or don't be bad. Instead, Grandin needed concrete examples, like we give flowers when we want to be nice, and that we don't hit each other when we're angry. This pragmatism served Grandin well when she began working with animals. Because Grandin understood concepts like death, pain, and suffering in concrete ways, she was able to identify tangible ways to alleviate suffering by developing humane slaughterhouses. Grandin believes that her autism has enabled her to see and experience the world differently, and that she is proud to be autistic. Now, notice here, all of this from here to here is summarizing Grandin's essay. So take a moment and look at your rough draft that you submitted for lesson 7. You have a paragraph that summarizes the This I Believe essay. And if not, you want to make a note and you want to go back and work on that for this week. While readers are familiar with Grandin and her work to promote ethical treatment of animals, she's been actively working and publishing since the 1970s, Grandin challenged what people believe about autism. Still, to understand Grandin's essay, it is important for readers to understand that 1, people with autism have not always been treated with dignity, and 2, that it's important that we treat autistic individuals with dignity, respect, and compassion, because when we do, all of our lives are enriched for it. Now notice here, this is my thesis statement. I took this from the Lesson 6 discussion forum. Now, I might need to revise it a little bit as I write the paper, right? Because I'm not locked into that. But if it gives you a pretty good idea, this would be my first discussion, and this would be my second. Now, let's look. Here's my subject heading. And notice my subject heading fits with what's in this first point of my thesis statement. It's a way of telegraphing for your reader. It's kind of creating some internal cohesiveness that makes it easier for your reader to see what your main point is. And it makes it easier for your reader to see when that point starts. So you see when it starts because I put a subject heading here for you. So now here's my topic sentence. In order to understand Grandin's essay and how her autism allowed her to see the world differently, it is important for readers to understand how mistreated and stigmatized people with autism have historically been in American society. There's my topic sentence. Now I need to explain that. You can almost hear me say, in other words, or this means that, unfortunately, the cultural logic was that people with autism were not smart, capable, and meaningful members of society. For example, in Inventing the Feeble Mind, James W. Trent Jr. describes how in the 19th century and earlier, people with mental impairments lived at home and were cared for during their entire lives by their families. But in the 20th century, state-run institutions became more common. The result is that people with cognitive impairments were institutionalized, abandoned, and left to suffer in overcrowded and underfunded group homes. Trent states that those what we label mentally retarded continues to be informed by the long history of condescension, suspicion, and inclusion. Now notice what I did here. Notice that I have the page numbers even when I'm paraphrasing. This is not a direct quote. This is a paraphrase, but I still have the author's name and I have the page numbers where that came from. You still have to include the author's last name, the author's first name the first time it appears in your paper, the source, title of it, notice that's right here. And then I put it in my own words, so I'm paraphrasing, but I still have to include the page number. Now this part right here with the quotation marks is a direct quote. And I have to have those quotation marks as well as the page number and the author's last name, even though it's, or because it is a direct quote. But notice here in this paragraph, I'm moving from general to specific. I went from generally speaking, about autism and about how autistic people were typically mistreated and stigmatized, to more specifically seeing an example of that in Trent's book, to more specifically a quote from Trent to support that. This was also the case for Grandin, who shares in her book, Thinking in Pictures, how Grandin was a very difficult child to manage, and her outbursts were sometimes very disruptive and aggressive. So, more specifically, we see it in the general sense in Trent's book, and in Grandin's book, we see it very specific at the individual level and as it relates to her life. So, in her book, Thinking in Pictures, Grandin describes what that looked like in her own life. In fact, right, more specifically, Grandin describes how people often assume that she doesn't have emotions or empathy because they only see the anger and fear. More specifically, Grandin writes, and I'm quoting her here, hence the quotation marks, "My childhood temper tantrums were not really expressions of emotion, so much as circuit overloads. When I calmed down, the emotion was all over. At puberty, fear became my main emotion. When the hormones hit, my life revolved around trying to avoid a fear-inducing panic attack. Teasing from other kids was very painful, and I responded with anger. I eventually learned to control my temper, but the threat of teasing made me fearful." Now, this is from Grandin's book, Thinking in Pictures, on page 89 and 90. Now, because I'm using two sources from Grandin, and it's not clear if I just put Grandin which source I'm talking about, I added the book title here in that in-text citation. So, this is significant because while a pervasive cultural logic was that those with autism were burdens on their families and should be hidden from society, Grandin's experience, as illustrated in her essay and book, shows that we have historically treated autistic people very badly. So notice here that this is the significance, bringing it all together. This is my idea. This is my point. So it's not cited, right? There's no in-text citation because I want credit for what I came up with. And then here would be my second discussion section. Now, I'm going to be real honest with you, and I was a little fatigued having written all of the course material and the models, and so I didn't finish that. So I left a note to myself that I would need to go back and finish. So I would need to develop this paragraph more and probably add another paragraph for this discussion section to be completed. So if you'll notice, returning back to our organization here, introduction, we had a lead-in and a background article reference that introduced the reader to the This I Believe essay and a thesis statement. And then if you'll notice in my first discussion section, I had a topic sentence. I explained that point. I provided examples from Trent and from Grandin, and I talked about the significance. And then I have a second discussion section with a topic sentence, an explanation. I would need to include an example, and then come back to the significance, and then a conclusion. So if you would like to look at that model, it's right here. You can follow along. And you want to start making sure that your paper starts to look like the model that I'm posting up. Okay? So remember that you have to show evidence of the writing process. So submitting your rough drafts here illustrates that, meets that requirement and fulfills that requirement for the course. You also want to comment on 2 of your classmates' posts in the discussion forum and complete 2 peer reviews. These are important because it's just as important for you to give feedback to other people to help them with their writing. It's really good for you to see how other students in the class approach the assignment. So you can see them in the discussion here below. All right, if you have any questions, I am online and I am here to help.